She was the most elegant woman in Hollywood. He was the most dangerous. And the night they stood in the same room, everyone at that party felt it. Two stars orbiting the same sky, too proud to admit they were watching each other. She looked at him once, then looked away. He noticed. He always noticed. But what Audrey Hepburn did not know that evening, what she could not have known, was that the quiet young man she had just dismissed without a second thought was about to become the most talked about actor in the entire world. And by the time she realized her mistake, it would be too late to take it back. Not because he was gone, but because she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain what she felt the night she finally saw him on screen. This is the story of two of the most iconic figures in Hollywood history. A story about pride and humility, about talent that refuses to beg for recognition, about the kind of moment that changes how you see someone forever. This is the story of Audrey Hepburn, James Dean, and the night she rejected him, and what happened 1 year later when she sat in a darkened theater and watched him prove to the entire world exactly who he was. It was the autumn of 1954. Hollywood was in a strange and electric place. The old studio system that had ruled the film industry for 3 decades was beginning to crack at the edges. The great era of the manufactured starred, the polished, controlled, carefully packaged idol created in the publicity departments of the major studios, was slowly giving way to something rawer, something realer, something that made audiences lean forward in their seats instead of simply watching from a comfortable distance. The cultural earthquake had already begun. People could feel it even if they could not yet name it. And in the middle of this shifting world, there was Audrey Hepburn. She had arrived in Hollywood like a gentle storm. Her debut in Roman Holiday in 1953 had earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress, a feat so rare for a debut performance that it had made the entire industry stop and pay attention. She had followed it with Sabrina in 1954, proving that the first film had not been an accident. Audrey Hepburn was not a flash in the pan. She was not a lucky girl who happened to be beautiful at the right moment. She was a genuine artist, disciplined, precise, deeply serious about her craft, and possessed of a natural grace that no acting school on earth could teach. By the time that autumn arrived, she was not merely a star. She was already becoming something larger, a symbol, an ideal. She moved through Hollywood with a quiet confidence that some mistook for coldness and others recognized as the particular self-possession of someone who had survived real hardship and come out the other side knowing exactly who she was. Audrey Hepburn had grown up during the German occupation of the Netherlands. She had known genuine hunger, genuine fear, genuine loss. She did not need Hollywood to tell her what was real and what was not. She could feel the difference in her bones, and so when she walked into a party in the Hollywood Hills on a warm October evening in 1954, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had already proved her worth and had no particular interest in proving it again. The party was one of those gatherings that defined the era, where producers and directors and rising talents all circulated through the same rooms, where deals were made in kitchens and careers were launched in backyards, where the air smelled of cigarette smoke and possibility. Everyone was watching everyone else, and almost everyone was pretending not to. James Dean was standing near the far wall when Audrey arrived. He was 23 years old. He was not, at that moment, famous, not truly. He had done some television work and trained at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg in New York, immersed in the method, a technique that demanded not performance, but genuine psychological excavation. Not the appearance of emotion, but the actual experience of it. To most of the people in that room, he was simply another young man trying to make his way. but to anyone who looked carefully. There was something about him that did not belong to the category of trying. He had the quality of someone who already existed fully, entirely, in his own skin. He stood near the wall in his jeans and his leather jacket, not quite fitting the room, not quite caring about that fact. Watching the party the way someone watches a film. With attention, with curiosity, without the anxious need to be seen watching. He saw Audrey Hepburn the moment she walked in. Most people in the room did. But where others turned toward her the way flowers turn toward light, James Dean simply watched. He had that quality. He could be absolutely still in a way that read as either profound confidence or total indifference, and the truth was probably somewhere in between. Someone introduced them. They spoke briefly, and what Audrey encountered in James Dean was something she was not entirely prepared for. He was not performing. He looked at her directly. He spoke quietly. He was not trying to impress her. He was not doing the thing that almost every other person at that party was doing. Presenting the best possible version of himself in the hope that she would recognize its value. He was simply there, simply himself, and that quality which in another context might have read as depth or authenticity, in the social context of a 1954 Hollywood party read primarily as something else. It read as unformed. Audrey Hepburn was a woman who had worked with William Wyler and Billy Wilder. She had won an Academy Award. She had learned to recognize readiness when she saw it. This young man, with his leather jacket and his quality of being somehow unfinished, did not look ready. He looked like someone who was still becoming. And Audrey Hepburn, who was already fully arrived, did not have particular time or inclination to wait around for someone else to get there. She was kind. That was always true of Audrey. She did not dismiss him with coldness or contempt. She was warm and pleasant and moved on, the way one moves on at parties, naturally, inevitably, toward the next conversation. She later told a close friend that she had found him interesting in a vague sort of way, but had assumed he was simply another promising young actor in a city full of them. James Dean watched her go. He said nothing. He stayed near the wall a little longer, finished whatever he was drinking, and eventually left the party without making a particular impression on most of the people there. But that is not where the story changes. What happened next unfolded over the following year with the slow, gathering momentum of something that had been inevitable all along, even when no one could see it coming. Elia Kazan had been preparing to adapt John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden for the screen, one of the most ambitious projects in Hollywood at that moment. The film would require its lead actor to carry extraordinary emotional weight, to embody a kind of longing so fundamental and so painful that it would make audiences feel it in their own chests. Cal Trask was a boy who had spent his entire life believing he was fundamentally wrong, fundamentally less than, fundamentally undeserving of the love he desperately needed. He was a boy for whom life was an open wound that would not close. Kazan had been searching for months. He had seen many actors. He had not yet found the person he was looking for. And then he saw James Dean. What remains consistent across all accounts of that first meeting is the director's reaction. Kazan said later that he knew within minutes. Not because Dean had performed brilliantly in his presence, though he had, but because something in the young man's particular quality of existence matched something essential in Cal Trask. Kazan looked at James Dean and recognized the wound. It was not performed. It was simply there. Dean got the role. Filming began. And what happened over the course of that production was something the people present would spend the rest of their careers trying to adequately describe. Dean was not acting in any conventional sense. He was excavating. He was pulling things up from somewhere so deep inside himself that it made the crew uncomfortable sometimes, made them feel like they were witnessing something private, something they perhaps should not be seeing. There were days when the set went completely silent, because no one wanted to break whatever was happening. Kazan had directed Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire. He had worked with the best of his generation. And he said, later, that directing James Dean was unlike anything he had ever experienced. That the young man did not approach a scene so much as inhabit it, so completely and so genuinely that the camera simply recorded what was actually happening rather than what was being created. By the spring of 1955, the whispers had started. The kind that spread from screening rooms to dinner tables to quiet conversations between people who trust each other enough to say things they are not yet ready to say publicly. Something extraordinary had been caught on film. A performance unlike anything in recent memory. A 23-year-old from Indiana who had done something that could not be explained away as luck or good casting or the alchemy of a talented director. Audrey Hepburn heard the whispers. Of course she did, but she had heard whispers before. The film industry ran on enthusiasm and projection, and many things that generated excitement in the screening room failed to translate into anything lasting. When they finally reached the public, she waited for the premiere with the same patient attention she brought to most things. East of Eden premiered in New York City in March of 1955. The reviews that arrived the next morning were unlike anything she had read in a long time. The critics, professional skeptics, professional resistors of hype, people who spent their careers being unimpressed by things the industry told them would be impressive, were using words they rarely used. Words like extraordinary, like genuinely moving, like once in a generation. They were saying that a 23-year-old boy from Indiana had walked into a Kazan picture and become something that was very difficult to describe with ordinary language. They were saying he was real, and that is where everything begins to shift. Audrey Hepburn arranged to see the film as quickly as she could. She went to a theater. An ordinary theater, in the way that a woman as famous as Audrey Hepburn in 1955 could manage ordinary. With discretion, with a hat, with the particular skill of public figures who have learned to move through public spaces without becoming the center of them. She sat in the dark. The film began. She did not watch East of Eden the way she typically watched films, with the trained, analytical attention of a working actress, with part of her mind always engaged in the technical assessment of what was happening on screen, how it was achieved, what choices had been made. That part of her mind went quiet very early in the film. Because what was happening on screen was not the kind of thing that professional analysis could adequately process. What was happening on screen was James Dean. She saw it immediately. She saw it in the way you see something you were not prepared for and cannot immediately categorize, with a kind of disorientation that is in fact the particular sensation of encountering something genuinely new. She had known, in the abstract, that the reviews had been extraordinary. But reviews are language, and language is always a step removed from the thing itself. The thing itself was James Dean's face, in close-up. Doing something that Audrey Hepburn, who had trained in this craft and lived in it and worked at the absolute highest level of it, could not entirely account for. He was not performing. That was the only way to describe it, even though it seemed paradoxical. There was no distance between the character and the man. There was no performance. There was only a human being in the full complexity of his interior life, and a camera recording it faithfully. And what that interior life contained, what James Dean brought to Cal Trask, what he excavated from wherever it lived inside him and placed directly in front of the lens, was a quality of longing so specific and so total that it was almost painful to witness. Cal Trask needed his father's love the way people need air. It was a fundamental requirement that was being systematically denied. And watching that denial happen in real time to someone who felt it the way Dean felt it, it was not comfortable. It was not the comfortable emotion of a skilled performance that keeps the audience at the proper aesthetic distance. It was the uncomfortable proximity of genuine human experience laid entirely open. Audrey Hepburn sat in the dark and felt her throat tighten. She sat with her hands in her lap and felt something happening that she had not expected and could not stop. The particular physical response of genuine emotion. Meeting genuine art. The response that bypasses all the careful intellectual apparatus and lands somewhere more fundamental. She was not watching a performance. She was watching a person. She thought about the party. She thought about the young man near the wall. She thought about how he had looked at her. Not the way people usually looked at her, not with the particular quality of wanting something from her, not with the social performance of finding her impressive. He had looked at her the way Cal Trask looked at everything in this film, with those eyes that did not know how to be anything other than completely open, completely vulnerable, completely themselves. She had looked away first. When the film ended, the lights came up. Audrey Hepburn sat in her seat for a moment longer than was necessary. She sat with the weight of what she had just watched. The way you sit with something that needs a moment before it can be moved. The person who accompanied her later said she did not speak for a long time after, and that when she finally did, it did not sound like an industry professional making assessments. It sounded like a person who had been moved in the way that people are moved when something true and unexpected lands in the center of them. That evening, she did something that required both humility and courage, two qualities that Audrey Hepburn had in genuine, not performed, abundance. She wrote James Dean a note. The note was private. Not meant for publication, not meant for the newspapers, not meant for the performance of public magnanimity that celebrities sometimes engage in when they want to be seen being gracious. It was a private piece of correspondence, and its existence became known only gradually, through the accounts of people close to Dean at the time. People he showed it to in the particular way that people share things that genuinely matter to them. The note said, in essence, that she had met him once and had not understood what she was looking at. That she had seen him now. That she was sorry for the first and grateful for the second. The specific phrasing that has survived in various accounts captures something essential about what she was trying to say. She told him that when she turned away from him at that party, she had turned away from someone she had not yet seen. And now that she had seen him, she did not think she would forget it. James Dean read the note. This is known because he kept it. He carried it folded in his pocket in the particular way that people carry things that mean something to them. Not as a trophy, not as evidence of status, but as something private and sustaining. A friend who knew him in the months that followed later described seeing him take it out once, read it, and fold it back up with the particular care of someone handling something fragile. The friend asked what it was. Dean said only that it was something someone had written to him, that he wanted to remember. What this moment contains is not simply the story of one person being wrong about another and having the grace to admit it. What it contains is something larger, something that speaks to the particular cruelty and particular beauty of how we encounter each other. The fact that we so rarely see people clearly in the moment of meeting them. That we so often bring our assumptions and our expectations to the encounter and see those things rather than the actual person standing in front of us. Audrey Hepburn had looked at James Dean in the autumn of 1954 and seen an unfinished young man. What she had not been able to see was that the quality she read as unfinished was actually the opposite. It was the quality of someone who had refused to finish himself into something more convenient. Someone who had refused to sand down the rough edges, to smooth out the complicated interior, to perform the appropriate version of himself for the appropriate audience. James Dean was not unfinished. He was simply unwilling to pretend. And that unwillingness, that refusal to accommodate the expectations of the room he was standing in, was not a flaw. It was the thing that made him extraordinary. It was the thing that Elia Kazan had recognized immediately, and that Audrey Hepburn had recognized, with a slight but significant delay, the moment she saw it on screen, where the camera's particular honesty stripped away everything except what was actually there. What was there was a human being of remarkable interior complexity, a person who had grown up in rural Indiana, who had lost his mother at 9 years old to uterine cancer, who had been sent to live with relatives he barely knew while his grief was still raw, who had carried that loss forward into everything he did and found, eventually, that the particular ache of it was not a wound to be healed, but a frequency to be tuned. A way of feeling the world that, when directed through the lens of a camera, became something other people recognized immediately because they had felt it too. In their own losses, their own longing, their own fundamental human experience of needing to be seen and not always being seen, James Dean had been rejected his whole life in one way or another. The boy whose mother died and whose father sent him away had learned to expect disappearance. And that expectation had not made him hard. It had made him porous. It had made him the kind of person who could not build adequate defenses against the world, and he had decided. At some point, that was probably not a conscious decision at all, to let that be true rather than spend his life pretending otherwise. What Audrey Hepburn saw on screen was the result of that decision. She saw a young man who had nothing between himself and the camera, nothing between himself and the audience, nothing between his own deepest experience and the expression of it. And she understood, sitting in the dark of that theater, that what she had dismissed at a party as being unformed was actually the rarest thing in her profession. Someone who had absolutely nothing to hide, because hiding was simply not an option. In the months that followed the release of East of Eden, James Dean became something that happens very rarely in the history of any art form. He became the thing that an entire generation recognized without being able to articulate why. He was 23 years old, and he was on movie screens across America, and the young people watching him were leaning forward in their seats because something in him was saying something to them that had not yet been said to them in quite that way. Something about the right to be complicated, the right to feel more than was comfortable or convenient, the right to be fully and completely yourself even when the world found that fullness inconvenient. He made rebel without a cause. He made giant. He drove too fast and gave interviews that confused journalists who were expecting the standard product and got something that refused to behave like a product at all. And through all of it, folded in his pocket, was a note from Audrey Hepburn. He showed it to people sometimes. Not often. Not performatively. The way you show people something that reassured you at a moment when reassurance was useful. The way you carry evidence that someone saw you truly, in case you need to remind yourself that being seen is possible. Audrey Hepburn had turned away from him once, and then written to tell him she had been wrong. And there was something in that sequence, the rejection followed by the recognition, that probably meant more to James Dean than a simpler story of immediate appreciation would have. because James Dean knew about not being seen. He had grown up not being seen in the most fundamental ways. And so, when someone who had initially looked past him came back and said, clearly and honestly, that she had missed something important, that meant something real. What happened after 1955 belongs to history rather than to the two people at the center of it. James Dean made 3 films. He became, in an astonishingly short period of time, one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. And then, on the last day of September in 1955, driving his silver Porsche 550 Spider on a California highway, he died in a collision at the age of 24. He had been a major film star for less than a year. Audrey Hepburn heard the news the way everyone in Hollywood heard it, suddenly, shockingly, in the manner of things that arrive without preparation and require a long time to absorb. She did not speak publicly about her reaction. That was consistent with who she was. Private about grief, private about the things that mattered most. But the people close to her in the days that followed described her as genuinely, deeply affected in a way that went beyond the ordinary sadness of learning about the death of a colleague. She was losing someone she had only briefly known. But she was also losing something larger, the particular promise of what James Dean's life in art might have continued to become. She had seen enough, in East of Eden, to understand what the world was losing, and she understood, perhaps better than most, the particular nature of that loss, because she had almost missed seeing it herself. She had almost turned away and kept walking, and if the film had not brought her back, she might never have understood what she had walked away from. That knowledge, the near miss of it, the fact that real things can be standing right in front of you, and you can fail to see them, does not leave a thoughtful person easily. Years later, in the mid-1960s, Audrey Hepburn gave an interview in which she was asked about the actors who had influenced her most profoundly. She mentioned several names, but there was a particular quality to how she spoke about James Dean. A particular care, as though the subject required more precision than ordinary conversation allowed. She said that she had met him once, briefly, and had not been sufficiently present to understand what she was encountering. She said that East of Eden had corrected her understanding in a way she did not forget. She said that one of the things she had learned, in the years since, was that talent of a certain kind does not announce itself the way that lesser things announce themselves, that it sits quietly against walls at parties, that it looks at you directly without trying to impress you, that it can be mistaken, very easily, for someone who simply has not yet arrived. She said that she had made that mistake exactly once, and that she was glad she had had the chance to correct it. The note that James Dean kept in his pocket was never publicly released. After his death, his belongings were gathered and catalogued with the particular sad efficiency that follows sudden loss. The note from Audrey Hepburn went into a collection of personal papers, and its exact current location is a matter of some debate among the people who care about such things. What is agreed upon is that it exists, that it was written and received and kept, that Audrey Hepburn, at the age of 25, looked at James Dean and looked away, that she looked at him again in a dark theater 1 year later and saw something that she had missed, that she wrote him a letter because she was the kind of person who believed that honesty, even difficult honesty, was something you owed the people you had misjudged, and that James Dean, who had spent his entire life not being seen by the people who should have seen him, carried that letter in his pocket as a small and private piece of evidence that he was visible, that he was real, that someone had looked and seen and been honest about what they found. They never spoke again after she sent the note. Their connection lived mostly in the negative space. in the things that were not said, the meeting that did not happen, the conversation that existed only on one side. But that is often the shape that the most significant encounters take. Not the long and obvious ones, but the brief and almost missed ones. The moment of not quite seeing, followed by the moment of finally seeing, followed by the particular bittersweet quality of understanding what you almost missed. Audrey Hepburn and James Dean, two of the most enduring icons of the 20th century. She, who would go on for 4 more decades to Breakfast at Tiffany's, and My Fair Lady, and a late career transformation into humanitarian work with the United Nations Children's Fund that would ultimately define her legacy as fully as any film she ever made. He, who would stop at 24, frozen in the amber of his 3 films, forever the age he was when the camera last recorded him. She had time to become many things. He had time only to become himself. Completely, fully, in the brief window that was available to him. But what he became in that window was enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that sits in the memory of everyone who encountered it and does not diminish with time. The kind of enough that makes a woman sit in a dark theater and feel her throat tighten for reasons she cannot immediately name. The kind of enough that makes someone reach for a pen and paper afterward and write, honestly and without vanity, that she had looked and not seen, and that she was sorry, and that she saw him now. He is still, all these decades later, one of the most recognizable human beings who ever lived. His face is on posters in cities he never visited. His name is spoken with the particular reverence that attaches to things that were brief and brilliant and entirely, irrevocably themselves. He changed what people believed was possible in front of a camera, and he did it in 3 films, over the course of less than 2 years, carrying in his pocket a note from a woman who had seen him clearly after seeing him wrong. And she, who lived long enough to watch the world continue to discover him, understood something about the economy of recognition that most people do not get the chance to understand. That it is never too late to see someone truly, but that the seeing, when it comes, costs something. It costs the comfortable certainty that your first impression was adequate. It costs the easy story of your own reliable perception. It costs a kind of pride that, once paid, leaves you more genuinely humble than any amount of deliberate practice ever could. Audrey Hepburn paid that cost. She paid it honestly, quickly, and without making a performance of the paying. And James Dean, who had spent his whole life waiting to be seen, folded the payment carefully and put it in his pocket and carried it with him. Which is, perhaps, the most human thing about this story. Not the fame, not the tragedy, not the cultural mythology that would grow up around both of their names in the decades to come. The most human thing is simply this: a young man who needed to know he was real, keeping a piece of paper that told him so. That is what great art does, at its best. That is what it has always done. It says to the person watching, you are real. What you feel is real. The difficult and inconvenient and complicated thing that you are is real, and it matters, and someone sees it. James Dean said that to an entire generation from a screen. Audrey Hepburn said it to him in a letter, and somewhere, in the silence between those 2 acts of recognition, something true about what it means to be human was quietly, permanently preserved. If this story moved you, please subscribe and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of second chances and the courage it takes to say, simply and honestly, that you were wrong and now you see, and leave a comment telling us about a moment when someone truly saw you for the first time. We read every single one.